Diego, how are you today?
Hello, Rashid. Happy to be here with you. Second season of our podcast. It's rocking and rolling, and Maduro's gone.
Yeah.
So it's been quite an eventful series of weeks, and we're ready to dive into that. So I just wanted to let you know I was surprised when this happened, like everyone was. But my take on this is that this will stand the test of time. Is a incredible maneuvering by Washington, and Trump's critics are. I would definitely count myself as one of them if we're talking tariffs or other topics, but I think he excelled here. Let's see what's about to happen, but there's a lot to discuss. Venezuela's ramifications are all over the region, all over Spain too. There's a China connection, there's an Iran connection. So much to unpack today.
I was in Plaza del Sol the day when Maduro was captured with all the other Venezuelans because I figured there's no reason for me to be there, obviously. But I thought I should go just because this event is going to be remarked about for years. So I took a train and head down there, and it was as what I expected: massive, massive rally, celebration, all the Venezuelans, the flags, the shirts, and being there, that at the same time, I'm in these group chats from Washington and the US, and people are debating the ethics, the law of the capture. I'm like, what a contrast.
I had some discussions at home with my wife, and I then came down to a shop near my apartment, and two Venezuelan ladies manage that. It's a nice, well, little cafe they have, and it's kind of has a literary take on, so you can also, and you can even, print your own stuff there and books and whatnot. And they were crying. We hugged and they were emotional. And I just came back home and I told her, my wife, these girls are not debating right now. These girls are hugging you and kissing you and really emotional about what just happened. And I think that, well, we can dive into many arguments that have been by all parties involved in this current situation. But above all, a tyrant has been dethroned. And the world's largest superpower has decided to assert its influence to be an element of real change in Venezuela. What else do you need? I think, regardless of what happens next, what has happened already is huge. And the implications for the region and for Hispanic affairs are going to be long and lasting.
I think there are two issues. One is the kind of person who is generally, a smart public policy, foreign policy person, the very general thanks that would read the Economist, Financial Times, Telegraph, things like that. But they have no real connection to Latin America, nor any sense of the history of Latin America, or the politics, or the people, entirely what I'm saying. And they only have this intellectual attribution to what happened. But in my mind, even if you only have an intellectual attribution, the way how they go about using mental models and metaphors and analogies still to me are false because you have other mental models and analogies in the region that you could use to discuss this kind of event and implications. Obviously, Panama comes to mind. And that comes up quite a lot in some conversations, but not as far as you should go.
The Noriega removal in
Correct.
Panama.
Yes.
An obvious comparison.
A
similar.
The obvious comparison.
We'll circle back to
Yeah,
that
we'll
later
get to that. But just was one thing. And I think even the Marco Rubio, he said this in an interview. He said, Americans' policy wonk circles have gotten so complacent with thinking about the Middle East. Everything is seen through the lens of a Middle Eastern operation, where you've forgotten completely that the US has done this kind of action in Latin America so many times over decades and decades to great success. It really goes to show how lack of understanding of the region right below Florida has now been engulfed in the American policy wonk circle.
And why are we recording a podcast about Hispanic affairs in English? Well, we are because one of the key voids in public debate right now, it's precisely that. The lack of coverage, period. And beyond that, lack of understanding. And we're trying to bridge that gap because there's not that much content, not that much thought being put into Hispanic affairs from the northern states, the English speaking countries, and whatnot. And it's quite a shame because the way in which the West sees itself should clearly incorporate a vision for the Americas. And that has been lacking in the analysis of many of these intellectuals and elites that have
Yeah,
been
it
discussing.
was this episode really show. I mean, this is something we knew. Obviously, we have a whole podcast on this topic, but truly, just the bad takes, the truly bad
Recurrent
takes.
bad takes on the
Yeah,
matter, yeah.
it just really puts this to light in a very clear way. We'll get into this.
Yeah, Argentina. Argentina, if you look at Milei has done
Mhm.
economic policy wise, that's your free market policies 101. And anyone that believes in these ideas would probably support most of what he's done, right? But at the international level, the only coverage that was even given to this is that how much of a lunatic this guy is
Right.
and how poorly Argentina is going to do. There's this manifesto signed by 100 economists, big guys, Nobel Prize winners and Stiglitzes of the world and the
Mhm.
Piketty's of the world. And they got it absolutely wrong. Everything they said would happen, the complete reverse has happened in Argentina. Or people arguing that the Bukele experiment would not be supported by the local population, that it was overreach and it was just outright wrong. And it's to the contrary, like 90% of the population actually do support the president. And give me an example of a free election where you get 9 out of 10 voters siding with you. And with Venezuela, it's been years of complacency, of thinking that nothing could ever change in Venezuela, nothing could be done about Venezuela. We could just lament Venezuela, but it was a given. Venezuela is a tragedy and it will stay a tragedy. And with a sweeping action in the middle of the night, a little spike in the pizza places around the Pentagon, little minds drawing together a plan, pulling the president into the room, and activating this amazing operation, well, the whole tectonic plates of the region have just shifted.
So I think what we can do here is we can get into a core question, our core tension people have, which is why should the USA intervene in the affairs of a foreign country? This is
Mhm.
the general tension and most people who are debating this have. Why should the US get involved in domestic affairs? This is one thing. At the same time, of course, when we're going to discuss this, we have to discuss that is it actually a simply question of the US having an interest in Venezuela? I think people think it's just that question. But Venezuela isn't just a country operating by itself in isolation. They're influencing everything around them negatively, corrosively, against the free world. Let's maybe start there perhaps. Why is it that the Maduro or Chavista regime actually was not just doing bad things inside Venezuela? What else were they doing?
It was a rogue player at the international system, and we don't get this straight. No calls to somewhat act in reaction to Venezuela would ever be understood. But it was a rogue state born out of a rogue state because it was essentially a Cuban funded, Cuban setup, a Cuban design. And throughout the Cold War, we saw the US take matters into action whenever Russian and Cuban influence were propping regime change in other territories within the region. What's happened in the last 25 years, it's a similar story. It was a Cuban design, a Cuban takeover of Venezuelan affairs. Just now, when Maduro was captured, he was essentially surrounded by a Cuban guards, dozens of them. Cuban foreign policy and Cuban security actors of the highest level were essentially deployed in Caracas to try and protect Maduro. Now, one of them has actually given a first person account of what happened, and they essentially just admit they were rendered. They were completely unable to even put up a fight, that it was a complete surrender, that the overwhelming capacity of the US military just essentially left absolutely no room for maneuver whatsoever. They couldn't even name the technologies that were used against them. And I'm no military expert, but they were pointing out as to the use of ultrasounds as a way to create confusion and unrest as the operation was going. And these folks were not equipped for that and did not even identify what sort of technology was being used. The weaponry that was also deployed was not properly identified by any of them. So the accounts that they have given, both the Cuban and the Venezuelan guards, is essentially, well, it's not just that we were overwhelmed. It wasn't even a fight. It wasn't even competitive. It was so quick, so effective, so dramatic, so powerful. It was done. We're done in the first minute. Kind of interesting, right? Because you have this big authoritarian regime, but all of its authoritarian power has been deployed against its own population. It's been rendered powerless in terms of defending the national sovereignty, which, by the way, they gave up from the first minute when they became a satellite for Cuban communism. But when Cuban communism fell because of its own design, and Venezuela could still get into these different side deals that we'll be speaking about today with China, its connection to Iran, the tacit understanding with Russia, that's when Venezuela leveraged the high prices of oil to become sort of overtake the role that Cuba was playing before in the region. So if you don't get that right, you won't get anything right when you're talking to Venezuela. It was a rogue actor. It was meddling in the affairs of every single country in Latin America. It was siding up with all the enemies of the US.
Do you have some examples of how it was meddling?
Sure. Venezuela actively funded, actively cooperated, and actively worked to subvert Colombian democracy under Alvaro Uribe throughout his entire presidency. The narco-terrorist groups in Colombia profited directly from having this de facto protection whenever they would step the other side of the border. And this nexus was also instrumental into setting up two leaderships in the region. The Ecuadorian presidency of Rafael Correa, which went on for almost 15 years, more than a decade, and that was funded directly by the FARC, the main narco-terrorist group in Colombia. And this connection between Venezuela and the terrorist groups in Colombia made up for all of that separate funding, not just to Ecuador, but also the connection with Bolivia, where the plants in which cocaine was being produced were essentially led by the operations that would later bring Evo Morales to power as a so-called union leader. That's three very obvious examples of his meddling in Colombia, his meddling in Ecuador, and his meddling in Bolivia. They set up their own international organization, ALBA, and the Sao Paulo Forum as their informal chain. And this pulled together even more populist and authoritarian regimes across the region, namely Argentina, Brazil under Lula and Dilma Rousseff, and of course Mexico under López Obrador. Chávez's fingerprints were all over the setting up of these Bolivarian regimes, and Maduro was the one in charge, trying to manage the decay of all of that structure, which was only powerful to begin with because of high oil prices.
In the Caribbean, where I'm born and raised, there's also Petrocaribe, which was a scheme by Venezuela under Chavez to provide cheaper oil to the Caribbean states. Why? Not to just be a quote-unquote good ally. Caribbean states are states, so they have very good votes in the UN and the OAS as well. So this was a subsidized oil program that even that time, this is it, early 2000s, mid 2000s, I wasn't yet very aware of politics. But I remember the Prime Minister of Barbados at the time, his name was Owen Arthur, an economist, and he refused to let Barbados join Petrocaribe, I believe. And I didn't get why. Like, why don't you want cheaper oil? This is obvious. But his thinking was like, no, this oil comes with strings attached. And at that time, still is, but much more at that time, Barbados and other English Caribbean countries were very US-centric, US aligned, and didn't even want cheaper oil because they're like, this is actually bad, tainted product. And even then he knew that. This is like, again, before Chavez really went down to hell, essentially. I remember the Petrocaribe aspect also of the Venezuela influence program. But beyond America Latina, or Latin America, there's also a lot of Spain connection too to Venezuela, correct?
Well, yes, I was giving you examples of the actual continent and the geographical region, but the cultural region does encompass Spain, this side of the ocean. And for sure, the Venezuelan regime has meddled with Spanish affairs through the years, essentially by setting up a communist party that became extremely successful because it was essentially developed.
Podemos,
This was, Podemos. Spain had had a small communist party since its transition to democracy in the mid-70s. It always existed, but its ceiling had been roughly 15 seats, more or less, in Congress, so it was never a relevant group. And these past years before the Great Recession, first half of the 2000s, and even the first half of the 2010s, their level of support was, around 5 MPs. Extremely irrelevant party. But Hugo Chavez first and Maduro later made sure to fund the activities that were around this Communist Party and conspiring to become the new leaders of this political platform, and funded them with at least 8 million euros through a foundation. So in order to avoid being in breach of the electoral laws in Spain. It was foreign funding that went into a foundation. And then that foundation led to the birth of Podemos, which was a spin off of all the far left separatist, well, not separatist, the far left communist groups in Latin America that came to power thanks to Hugo Chavez. Now, here, certainly, the funding was given to them. That's proven. And they are in government now. Their current iteration is called Sumar, and which was born out of Podemos.
How was that born out of I still was not very clear about that connection between Podemos and
And
Sumar.
Sumar, well, it was essentially the local platforms that partnered with Podemos, then branched out on their own at some point, and that led to the evolution of first you have the old Communist Party, then you have the Venezuelan funding for a Communist Party that becomes so powerful and relevant in Spain that is holding office in cities like Barcelona, which it did for 8 years at the local policy level. The vice president right now, one of the vice presidents in Spain, comes from that political platform. And in this past few years, although the original group, like we said, was the dynastic Communist Party, and then came the Bolivarian Venezuelan funded Podemos group, the current iteration is slightly different because, of course, the Venezuelan money dried up. Mm-hmm. And some of the local partners decided to set up their own coalitions and their own groups. Right now, technically speaking, Podemos is not the name of the Communist Party in government, but still, everything that's happened to Spain in relation to having a far left group that is well funded and is actively grabbing power and implementing its horrible policies in our country was Venezuelan funded.
But also at the European level, because Podemos has MEPs in the European Parliament too.
Yes, and whenever the European Parliament is deciding whether a Chinese state company should be allowed to enter contracts in the realm of security or telecommunications, you have Spanish MEPs who come from a platform that was funded by Venezuela, arguing actively against any sort of control and for the Chinese takeovers of these areas and strategic sectors. And that's just one example of the many we could give, because it's really being everywhere. The Nicaraguan regime, which is starting to release some political prisoners in fear that a similar operation could happen there, has also been propped up and supported by the Venezuelans through the last year. So Venezuela, you could argue, why should we meddle in the affairs of Venezuela? It's the other way around, my friend. Venezuela has meddled in the affairs of so many countries over the past few decades. Corrosively.
Another big issue that comes up a lot is this concept of Maduro as the head of state of Venezuela. And because of that, he should have these different immunity and so on and so on. But of course, the easy answer is you could debate the head of state immunity, sovereign immunity. The problem is that Maduro is not the head of state of Venezuela because of something we call elections.
Yeah. The 2024 election was the most obvious example of the rampant electoral violations that happened in Venezuela for the last 15 or 20 years. It is true that in the first 5-10 years of the regime, when Hugo Chavez was president, those elections were essentially won by the Chavista platform with a majority of the popular vote. That does not imply, and I want to make that very clear, that those were democratic elections by our standards. If we think or believe that a democratic election is a lot more than respecting the number of votes that go into the different ballots, right?
Yeah.
So if opposition leaders are banned from running for office or outright just put into jail, like it happened through the Chavista regime, that's not a clean election by any stretch of the imagination. If you use state propaganda on a 24/7 cycle where you essentially ban private media, you close down newspapers and radio stations and TV channels, and you broadcast government messaging all day long, all night long, that is not also a clean election by any stretch of the imagination. But this time in history, it is true that the oil prices were so high that the subsidies given out by the government were so generous that majority of the population, unfortunately, was siding with these policies. As this was taking place, as Chavez was rolling out this rampant repression of political pluralism, of social pluralism, he was also taking over the private economy, the private industry, the sector, which was left in shambles. There's a very famous video It's called Hugo Chavez expropriating businesses, something like this. You can just go on YouTube and Google Hugo Chavez expropiese. And you can just see Hugo Chavez broadcasting a walk around the streets of a city in Venezuela, and him just asking local leaders, who does this building belong to? He gets the answer, and his reply is expropiese, which translates, well, then have this expropriation, nationalize it, take it away from the rightful owners. So this was done to several industries, businesses, private individuals, but the oil prices were high. The farce could be played for a little longer, but once the oil prices came crashing down, the subsidies ended, and no longer was that segment of the population that was unfortunately still in support of the regime in spite of authoritarian practices, no longer did they side with them. And boy, did that initiate a harder crackdown, because for the last 10 years, what was initially clearly an authoritarian state became a totalitarian state. That's why 8 million people ultimately just left the country. It was in total economic ruin, but there was no freedom whatsoever to dissent, to protest. Those that took to the streets through the years were randomly arrested, tortured, executed by the regime. We're friends and acquainted with people that have been put through hell by the Venezuelan regime, and we will have them on the podcast later on this season. People that have been thrown into jail for simply being members of a different party or engaging in political demonstration against the dictatorship. And the pinnacle of this came, as you said, in the last election.
Yes, and that, of course, was the now famous Maria Corina Machado.
Who wasn't even on the ballot.
Yeah, so she was banned from running
Exactly.
an election, as your point, to be clear. Her surrogate, essentially,
Edmundo
Gonzalez, he ran. It was just super surrogacy symbolism.
Very senior diplomat. Completely unknown. Just standing in as a surrogate.
Just completely only as a surrogate for Machado. And
Machado, who is the Nobel Peace Prize, as you all probably know.
Yes. And her party, her group, won the election. But now here's the question comes in. How do you know, Rashid and Diego, that they won the election? Because officially, the government said Maduro won the election. Now, we don't have direct interactions in there. So what happened there? Well, the opposition parties and coalitions were very smart. They knew what was going to happen. So what they did, they organized a very, very rigorous campaign to connect the actors, which is to do the
individual record in each electoral district, yes. and even in each single point of voting.
Each single vote, yes. All the records of vote, which is a thing that Latin America does, but other countries don't actually do. So I think that's one thing people get confused by in the U.S. Because the U.S., they don't have actors. That's not a concept you have in the election. In Latin America, you do have this. So what they did a massive campaign to collect as many actors, vote records, to show what people voted for and who they voted for. And they took all the tally sheets to Panama. Edmundo flew to Panama with these tally sheets in hand and put them in the National Bank of Panama's vault. The Panama president allowed this because he's very anti-Chavistas, anti-Maduro, anti-socialism. These are neighboring countries. And he says, hey, we're going to keep all the actors here safe so anyone can come and check and tally and do the actual calculations and the analysis and the models and so on. So when these studies were done, it was overwhelmingly certain that Maduro could not have won the election based on the models based on the actors that were collected.
We have the full evidence of the real result. The official result claimed that Maduro had won with 51% of the popular vote, and 44%, supposedly, allegedly, had voted for Edmundo Gonzalez. Now, these physical proof of the results, which was verified by countless numbers of international observers, many of whom had to make their way into Venezuela because they were not officially allowed into the country to oversee the election, that the real result was somewhat closer to a 70-30 win for Edmundo Gonzalez, which is coherent with other polls that regularly gave Chavismo no more than a 20 or 30% support. So the election was stolen, and many of these intellectuals, yet idiots, who speak about these topics seem to completely forget, or shall I say, are apparently willing to act as if they did not know that this happened, because the world knows, everyone knows that
Everybody
this
knows.
happened. We're just walking everyone through the play by play here, but everyone knows that election was stolen, period. We're just giving you the small details of how we know it was stolen and what the percentages really were, and so on. And those pretending that international law is a concern now really need to explain where were they for the last 25 years when elections were regularly stolen, not only this one, when opposition leaders were banned from running for office
That's
or
right.
outright put in jail. It happened to Leopoldo Lopez, who was incarcerated
Yes.
for years, then left and lived on exile here in Madrid.
Tyler has a podcast with him.
Yeah, Tyler Cohen.
Yeah.
And it's a very enlightening conversation. Or why did, according to international law, the National Assembly take control of the country following the Venezuelan constitution when a series of breaches of power had taken place by the national government? The dictatorship was not following its own constitution. The assembly took action, recognized the president of the legislative power, Juan Guaido, as its democratic leader. The international community recognized this overwhelmingly. And what did the regime do? Nothing. Just shoot everyone, take into the streets, and incarcerate everyone they could, and run everyone else on exile.
What ever happened to Guaido?
Well, he's resurfaced these days
Okay.
because many opposition leaders are jockeying for position,
Right.
as that transition seems to be within sight. But many people have argued that Guaido did not put up the same fight that Lopez did back in the day, or Machado did. Well, really, she's done it for at least 15 years at the highest level, and definitely leading the opposition for the last 5 years. I know Maria Corina Machado personally. I don't know if I have spoken about this with you off of the podcast before, or am I just breaking this news to you right now?
I do not remember.
So it seems like I should have told you this, but I don't think I have. So I first met with her in 2010. So we go 16 years back. And I interviewed her as she was campaigning to become the leader of the Venezuelan opposition, which is something she was involved with for many years. And from my point of view, that of a Spanish classical liberal or libertarian looking at what was going on in Venezuela, I always found that the opposition leaders were too socialist for my taste. There was a Chavista state of mind in many of them,
Okay.
as they would advocate for a democratic change. Yes, for sure. I can't take that away from when they were all freedom fighters in the sense of political freedom. But when you talk to them about how should a future Venezuela look like, they essentially envision a social democratic Venezuela. Their economic speech, their vision for the country was essentially one where the state would still have a very relevant role in economic life and many other aspects of daily life. And Machado stood out to me. That's how I got to know her, because she would fly to Madrid, and we've spoken about this on the first season of our podcast about how Madrid has and will remain to be the hub where classical liberals and conservatives from all Latin America meet and conspire.
You also mentioned Edmundo's also in exile here.
Yeah.
In Madrid as well.
Edmundo is in exile.
Always Madrid.
Yeah, Leopoldo Lopez, he was recognized as the key leader of the opposition. He did not go to, Florida, like you could potentially anticipate. He came to Spain. Yeah, his father decided to join local politics and became a member of the European Parliament.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Leopoldo Lopez Sr. stood for election as an MEP, as a European Parliament member, and won seat.
With which party?
With the Popular Party here in Spain. And in Madrid, he was very involved with Ayuso too. And then, of course, his son exiled in Madrid. Edmundo González, the legitimate winner of the last election, exiled in Madrid. And I first met with Maria Corina and met with Maria Corina through the years in Madrid. And that's how I know her. And I specifically also know the manager of her economic platform, who is a very remarkable scholar based in Florida. She's on exile, of course, because of the situation, but she remained in Venezuela through the years and fought the good fight. And her name is Sari Levy. She is an expert in international property rights, an area she has researched and excelled at. She has partnered with Hernando de Soto, a very famous Peruvian economist, to produce the annual International Property Rights Report for the Property Rights Alliance, which is an international group of liberal-minded organizations. And she is responsible for the Maria Corina Machado's economic platform, which calls for privatization of the energy industry, liberalization of the economy, and whatnot. That's the connection with Machado and her team. And yeah, they won the election. She wasn't on the ballot, but essentially they won the election. And it was taken away from them, just like everything that was taken away from Venezuelans.
Another very maybe downplayed these days. But there's some good reporting again here in Spain by ABC about the Chinese, Iranian, Venezuelan nexus, which is again not the most fun grouping of words to use in the same sentence. But to me, before we get into it, I was surprised it was a Spanish newspaper that did this reporting.
It was, but it should be noted that a Spanish journalist who is the White House correspondent for ABC, David Alandete, he's managed to establish a very interesting rapport with the U.S. institutions. So he has regular conversations with the White House and Q&A with the president himself, who clearly respects his work. So he gets firsthand access to these. Department of Justice and Department of State info and intel have clearly been shared with him at some points to address some of these developments. So you can learn a lot about what this rogue connection of China, Venezuela, and Iran looks like by reading the Spanish press. Problem is the Spanish press publishes in Spanish. So we're hoping to walk our listeners through some of that reporting now. But as we do, please, because I know you're very familiar with Chinese meddling in Latin America, the Chinese meddling in Venezuela, this whole nexus, could you walk us through what it looks like? Because we're just throwing a lot of stuff out there. We've spoken so far of a Venezuela meddling in Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, of course, Spain too. We've spoken of how the elections were regularly stolen and how there is no case to be made that this regime would be at any point a respected entity as an international player when it's an outright dictatorship. But now we're just throwing in China. So the whole conversation just begins even more complex and fascinating.
So the Chinese part is quite substantial because of the money involved. To give some really good context, so it's very clear for listeners, China's interest in Latin America is one of how does China project power and how can China do that while trying to somewhat have loose allies. I say loose allies because it's more of a metaphor. Because China does not actually, China meaning the CCP, the governing body of China, doesn't really structure its operations and affairs in allies the way how the US or Europe would think about that kind of concept.
There's not a NATO of sorts.
Correct.
There's not an international organization group in
So
Spain.
they do have international organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Forum and things like that, but these are very loose. There are no treaty obligations.
Forum
Yes,
type of deals.
Like cooperative organizations. There's no NATO. There's no EU. It is very loose. There's no treaty obligation type network compared to the US. China has always been far away from the West for a long time. And they initially wanted to do a lot more, again, reach of their economy and their politics across the world. This is not a new thing. This has been going on for a long time. So one of the very first international development projects of China was actually in Guyana, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, back in the 80s. And you can go a bit further than that, actually. If you think about, there is this really big idea when you think about Russia or Soviet Union China relations. This is the Stalin Mao split, more or less. And this was a difference when Mao and Stalin had a very different appreciation of how the third world, the communist agenda should happen globally. And one of the big things that happened to cause this split is what we now know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a big issue. When Stalin essentially pulled out the missiles and Mao was like, how are you going to be bowing and kowtowing to the Western world and these kind of things, where Mao thought Stalin's position was very weak and very feeble, and he said we Chinese to go our separate ways. That was actually the Cuba-Caribbean connection that caused that big split. Fast forward many years, and this idea of globalizing China was still a thing. But the idea of globalizing China started very substantially with Jiang Zemin, who was the president in the late 90s or 2000s. And that really accelerated with what we now know as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which is very weird because in Chinese it kind of means one belt, one road, 一带一路 in Chinese. So it's very weird translation to English. And Xi Jinping, he wanted to have this kind of externalization of not only Chinese power, but just Chinese manufacturing, Chinese influence, Chinese loans, just have a big player in the world. Why should the US be the big player? We are going to be as big or bigger than the US. So the Belt and Road, BRI, became this signature project. So when initially it was just like nearby, like, the Philippines to Thailand, that kind of stuff. And then they say, we need to go bigger. We should go closer to the Western world. And of course, they had a friend, which is Cuba, Castro. They had a big friend in the Caribbean. So when the Chinese government went to Cuba to set up these deals and just have conversations and eye-to-eye type project, Castro said, you know what? I know a guy. I think you guys should meet. That was Hugo Chavez. So Castro introduced actually Chinese team to Chavez. They had no connection at all with China. It was through Cuba that it happened. And after they had the meetings with Chavez and so on, literally less than a year later, China started to give billions and billions and billions of dollars into Venezuela. And
Soft loans.
soft loans is a tricky thing. There were loans. And the point was to be repaid in many aspects. But again, the Chinese, because they have this idea of developmental state, they thought that Chavez would use the money to grow the economy. Because if they say, hey, we have a partner in Latin America that has oil and has actually a big economy, a big population, if they're also stronger, we are also stronger because they can buy our goods and we can buy their oil and all that nice stuff. It was very naive of the Chinese to think this, of course, because they're thinking they're a friend of over there. But Chavez did not use the money for that. He used the money for paying allies. He used the money for paying random social projects. There's so many big projects in Venezuela, like big train lines, the port construction, that were all started not even midway 10% completed. So in all, the calculation is China loaned Venezuela about around like 60 billion US dollars worth of loans. Some were repaid, most were not. And this part will come to Iran now. So very recently there was some reporting, and this was very was known for a long time. But when the sanctions on Venezuela and Iran really started heating up, there was some speculation that is somewhat now confirmed that the reason why also China gave so much money to Venezuela was because Venezuela indirectly was funneling that money to Iran.
Correct.
And essentially China getting the oil, kind of oil loans for oil type arrangement with Venezuela. But the reason it was so much was because also China was using Venezuela to pay Iran for different expertise and different goals.
Exactly.
So that was this weird nexus of evil.
It's a opaque and multi-layered scheme, financial scheme, by which Venezuela has not just continued to get funding from the Chinese, who by now obviously understand that they're not getting their money back, but still choose to pursue this alliance because, well, what are they going to do? Side with Milei? And not that they cut ties with Milei, because at the same time, they're quite pragmatic.
They don't look tie cuts. That's not a thing China does.
Milei referred to them as a relevant commercial partner recently. And Bukele was very happy that they built a stadium for him in El Salvador.
Also a library. I was in the library.
You were physically in a library built by the Chinese.
Yes, physically in the library in San Salvador. And I spent a lot of time in China. It literally looks like you took a library from a third tier city in China. Yeah, third tier is still very high. And just plop it in El Salvador.
In the middle of El Salvador.
It looks the exact same way.
But that's so Chinese.
Yes.
Such a Chinese thing to do. Yeah. But so the Venezuelans were playing that role. And how were they doing that? Well, they have been dealing with sanctions for a long time. So has Iran. But many of the neighboring options for Iran are not available to them because it's a regime that is not well liked among its own region by many of the areas and jurisdictions where it could potentially entertain some little shenanigans to get around the sanctions. But that's not the case with the Venezuelan actors who have been able to use countries like Cuba as a hub through the years and who have set up different series of companies and structures. One of the common links seems to be the Dominican Republic, which has played also a role in the dark shipping of Venezuelan oil. Now, in principle, Venezuelan oil has been sanctioned since the election and even prior to that, was subject to some limitations on its international sales. In practice, you can always ship oil without declaring that you're doing so, changing the origin of the shipment.
Many are often Panama flagships, so that's
Exactly.
also makes it more complicated also.
Exactly. So there is this, like, the oil will be shipped from, of course, physically from Venezuela, but it will be placed in a series of shipping boats that have different flags that will reroute this oil into different jurisdictions in which this can be resold. And that was a way of circumventing these sanctions. And the Dominican Republic played a key role as the financial nexus for all of this. There is something about corrupt socialism and Dominican Republic that has regularly made the rounds here in Spain whenever there is talk of, especially talk of the Socialist Party in our country. And I can share the anecdote of a...
Before we share that.
Yes.
But the Dominican Republic isn't socialist. So
No.
when this comes up, it's always confused to me. So you're sharing, could you explain
Yes.
why this also is?
No one has really pressed the Dominican authorities until the last year. It was, yes, not run by socialists, but indeed run by corrupt politicians.
Sure.
Who
Okay.
obviously didn't mind the flow of cash and were looking to turn and just look the other way. Now, the US has started to exert pressure in the last year or so. And it's interesting that the counter pressure for that was the Spanish government, which is also run by a socialist party, which has, again, many suspicious financial ties to the Dominican Republic. Case in point, even the president's wife is suspected to have tried to get a Dominican passport. And that has not been denied either by her or the Dominican Republic authorities. So, as we've spoken about in our flash episode about socialist corruption in Spain, she's under investigation for several wrongdoings. Is that the exit route? Is she planning to make an escape? Well, that's making the rounds as maybe a conspiracy theory, call it if you wish. But then again, you start hearing things and reading things. And even you get these stories told firsthand. This is the first time I shared this publicly. A family member who is a pilot has shared with me the fact that he's taken former Prime Minister Rodríguez Zapatero to the island, and that as soon as he arrived on the airport, there was a helicopter ride waiting for him to take off and go to Venezuela. Using the Dominican Republic as a hub, as a conduit for many of these wrongdoings seems to be a recurrent theme, and we will have to probably do a more concrete episode about the role they have been playing for the last several years. But with Venezuela, all this incrementing essentially meant that, yes, not only was it a way to keep afloat, but it was also a way to keep supporting Iran. By the way, Iran was also supporting the communists here in Spain. The funding for the Communist Party Podemos did not only come from that foundation, which had been supported by the Bolivarian regime in Venezuela, but also by the Ayatollah regime in Iran, which, for example, funded the TV show and the TV station where Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, the far-left party in Spain, would broadcast and essentially build up his media platform that eventually led to him being a vice president.
Yeah.
That Iranian connection was not just about sharing money, Chinese capital. No, it was also about a joint, concerted effort.
You said vice president?
Pablo Iglesias was, vice president under Pedro Sanchez in between 2019 and 2021, when he left the vice presidency to run for election in Madrid against Libertarian Governor Ayuso, who defeated him soundly, which led to this Bolivarian-funded leader of the Spanish communists to step down and let his wife, a mother of, well, they're not married, but his girlfriend and mother of his children to become the new leader of Podemos.
That detail I didn't actually know.
Well, now you know.
Now I know.
That's what the White House said, by the way, when they published this very short tweet of Donald Trump overseeing the operation in Venezuela, saying something like, Donald Trump is for real. If you didn't know, now you know.
Yes,
well, if you didn't know
yes.
that about another connection, the Iranian connection, funding communism in Spain and taking it all the way to the vice presidency, well, now you know.
There was also, or is also, a famous...
Wait, let me stop you right there just for a second. Funny feminism, the one we have in Spain. Feminism funded by Iran. And feminism where the key leader of the party, a woman, her political career is essentially being the girlfriend of the leader.
Right.
So a fun way of understanding feminism.
What's her name?
Irene Montero, current member of the European Parliament.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where she regularly votes in favor of the Venezuelan regime, against any type of measure against the Iranian regime.
She was the Minister of Labor before, or
She
something?
was the Minister of Equality,
Equality.
and she did the amazing feat of changing a law. She called this the law for sexual freedom and whatnot.
I say no means no. That's a different law.
Yeah, well, that one, yeah,
No
but
means no, right.
that law led to the release of more than 1,000 convicted sexual felons. So that's how these feminists roll.
Yes, and on this same thing, I never pronounced his name properly. Another member of Podemos that was supposed to be a very high core feminist. He was tried recently for sexual offenses. It was the
Oh yeah, Íñigo Errejón.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that name is hard for a Spaniard. So, but some fun feminism, the one we have in Spain. We've already spoken about how the socialists would use government money to hire prostitutes and whatnot.
Yes.
But the communists in Spain also have their own thing. But that for another episode.
There was a mention in a famous or infamous video of one of the Podemos members dancing on stage with Maduro.
Yeah, well,
in Caracas.
Well, of course. Well, we could have started there. The constitutional architecture of the authoritarian regime in Venezuela was essentially drafted by Spaniards, Spanish professors from the Complutense University, a government-owned Spanish university, a perfectly fine university if you're talking several areas of research and studies. But if you are talking political science, journalism, and some other degrees, if you walk into that campus, that feels like you're walking into Comanche territory. And some of these professors were leading intellectuals for Chavez, not even Maduro, from Chavez. They were the building pillars of the repression. They were given counseling to the regime on how to suppress the opposition.
Mm-hmm.
The contracts that these foundations signed with the Venezuelan regime, the concept for this sort of political guidance and assistance, one of the key concepts for those contracts was how to suppress opposition leaders. So the folks that were coming up with the schemes to repress political freedom in Venezuela were Spaniards. They were funded by the Venezuelans who were more than happy to have these folks on board. There's a guy we'll call Juan Carlos Monedero, who was one of the founders of Podemos and is now disgraced because a lot of Me Too type of allegations started creeping up against him. And yeah, again, the way to go wrong with feminism these communists have.
Yeah.
But the same could be said of others, like Eduardo Serrano was one of the key architects of the constitutional arrangements in Venezuela. And by the way, all of these folks were also in bed with the Ecuadorian regime of Correa too, funded by him through a series of, government agencies, and also very present in designing what repression and socialism looked like in Ecuador for far too long too.
So those connections are, they go very, very, very deep. It's not simply just some random dictator in Caracas. People have that feeling very strongly.
Which, by the way, justifies the fact that we may be looking into a complex transition. So you could argue, well, if you just get rid of the head, and just cut the head from the snake, then the whole problem is fixed. It's not, because the entire state is rotten. The military is rotten. The power structures are rotten. Everything about Venezuela is rotten. So that's why transition, which is one of our topics for today's discussion, and we'll get into that later, looks very complex. How do you unmeddle all that Iranian, Chinese influence, Cuban influence? How do you disconnect from that overnight?
Also, to add more color to the Iranian connection. So there are many examples of Iranian operations happening from Caracas and different parts of Venezuela, including, for example, even not only Iran, but also like Hezbollah, for example, also have there are like these documentations, court cases in the US, from Israel, also evidence that they compiled and released about Hezbollah operations in Venezuela, supported by the Maduro regime. And there was this like a movie type scenario where Hezbollah operatives kidnapped Iranian American journalists from the US. And you would think, oh, of course, they're trying to put her direct to Israel. No, they were taking her to Caracas. There's an old court case in the US about this. It's like very recently.
You just brought to my attention this episode, and I just remember now that roughly 50 active terrorists from ETA, the separatist terrorist group from the Basque country in Spain that ended the lives of 1,000 individuals and terrorized the lives of millions of Spaniards through the years. Currently a disbanded terrorist organization, but sort of reformed itself as a political organization, which is part of the parliamentary coalition of the current
It's
government.
Bildu.
Yeah, under the Bildu brand. And the intelligence reports for the Spanish authorities have claimed that around 50 members of ETA, of ETA, were essentially flew to Venezuela and were given protection in Venezuela. And there is a lot of legal rulings that highlight these connections, these exiles. Of course, the government in Venezuela never admitted this, but individuals like former President Jose Maria Aznar, who had, of course, was the main politician who ultimately showed that ETA could be defeated without resorting to state terrorism, which at one point was sponsored by the Socialist Party in Spain. That is quite an unknown and dark part of our democracy. But in the late 80s and early 90s, the Socialist Party was sponsoring state terrorism against a terrorist group, sort of a paramilitary affair to try and stop and counter
Very
terrorism.
Duterte Philippines type
Uh-huh.
operation.
Exactly. And again, Spanish socialists. So their list of sins just goes
Yeah.
on. La PSOE. But the point to bring it home with the discussion about Venezuela, the prime minister, the president at the time was Aznar. Now, for our listeners are probably familiar with this. We call them presidents. They are prime ministers, but we call them presidents. President Aznar has highlighted how Venezuela played a role in supporting the terrorists from ETA through the years. And of course, he had the intel and he has the track record because he basically was the key leader in turning ETA into a almost finished terrorist group, which disbanded later, but they were essentially done by the end of the Aznar period. So whatever you look at, Iran, Hezbollah, China, Spanish terrorism, Spanish communism, other authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Caracas is to 2020s what Cuba was in the 1960s and 70s for many American countries.
There was again, I think I shared this with you recently. It's a clip I found on Twitter X with Aznar in a panel discussion from other people, other presidents, including Zapatero. And then Zapatero left. I don't know what the context was.
Yes.
And then Aznar was like, "Where are you going? To Caracas?" What happened there? Do you remember what that context was?
That was the first time that he was publicly called out for being, in bed. Well, because we're referring to Zapatero, who was a socialist prime minister of Spain, the president between 2004 and 2011. If you recall, Spain went almost bankrupt under his presidency, so horrible economic management. But beyond that, he has later reinvented himself as Nicolás Maduro's international diplomat. So whenever he would steal an election, Zapatero would come out and say, no, the election was clean. Whenever he would imprison someone, Zapatero would say, well, but we're working for peace. Whenever there would be international pressure against the regime, Zapatero would argue, well, we need to reduce this tension. So essentially, few people have done more to validate the Venezuelan regime than Zapatero, and he's a disgrace for Spaniards and probably the most hated Spaniard in Spain and in Venezuela. So that clip you referred to he was put together with other presidents of the Spanish democracy, previous presidents. Some were socialists too. They were present there, Felipe González. And he stood up in the middle of the discussion because he apparently had to go somewhere and was in a rush, which doesn't look too elegant to do.
Yeah.
And so Aznar, half jokingly, half serious, essentially told him as he was literally walking out in the middle of a crowd that was attending the event, he told him, well, you're in quite a rush. Where are you going? Are you going to Caracas? And then he said, watch out, be careful. But this connection is longstanding. And to circle away from Spain and more into Latin America, every citizen in Latin America who has suffered a socialist regime, a socialist Peronist government in Argentina, they know this because their leaders have been essentially funded by Venezuela, supported by Venezuela. This nexus and this connection is very much real. And Spain just got, one of the loose ends of these many, many different complex nexuses that emerge once you start looking into what Caracas has been doing. Again, you made this comment at the beginning of it. Why should the U.S. or why would the U.S. meddle in the affairs of Venezuela? It's completely the other way around. There's not a single democracy in Latin America that has not been hurt by the Venezuelan dictators. There's not a single Western country that has not suffered directly or indirectly from the cozying up to China and Iran. And there's not a single Venezuelan that has not suffered the consequences of stolen elections, massive poverty and rampant totalitarian practices by the Bolivarian authorities. That's the truth.
It's one of those things where context here is such a curious thing. I have friends that do not know any Venezuelans. They've never met a Venezuelan. They don't know any
There's a bunch
Venezuelans.
of them out of the country right now. 8 million have left on exit.
And yet, again, people I know don't know any of them. I mean, like DC and like in the UK, I have friends that do not know any Venezuelan people.
Would you argue they need to leave the house a little bit more?
No. But I think, they're generally well traveled. Again, it's a context thing also. I mean, there are people I know I don't know of, but don't have any like Chinese friends, like from China.
Yeah.
They're made Chinese people.
No, I get it,
Same thing, right? So it's interesting we're like, from my or our perspective, it's such a banal discussion.
Yeah.
But for most people, this really is like,
If you don't know someone
Exactly.
from that has boots in the ground,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
maybe you're missing on some of the stuff.
they're like an expert or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, these days, of course, the failure that is socialism in modern times, Venezuela is the poster child for that. Of course, you could argue, North Korea or Cuba, but in reality, in the mid-90s, this has become a very popular comparison to make. Venezuela was just as rich as Poland was. Not to say Poland was extremely rich because it was coming off decades of socialism and communism, but it was starting to take off. But Venezuela at the time was a fairly reasonably developed country in a developing region. Whereas today, Poland is the country with the highest growth accumulated in the last 30 years. And Venezuela is the country where 70% of the population are in absolute poverty. And the average, watch how socialism works as a diet. That is indeed true. The average Venezuelan has lost 11 kilograms, 22 pounds. That's such a nasty outcome of because we measure outcomes in income. Well, income, if you want income, their income right now is comparable to what it was in 1945. You can measure inflation. I've run out of zeros to kind of express the accumulated inflation rate. I think the accumulated inflation rate for their period is you put a 1 and then you throw 14 zeros.
It's like 2 million something. Numbers are high.
Extremely high. But beyond that, let's measure it in weight. You want to lose some weight? Go to Venezuela. The average Venezuela, that's an average, by the way, or so. But the average Venezuela has lost more than 20 pounds under socialism.
It's horrific. And we have to explain that time and time again. Now, the singular focus, obviously, in the last few weeks was the direct intervention of the U.S. military in Venezuela to take Maduro back to the U.S. And of course, typically people use the analogy of Middle Eastern comparisons, as I mentioned earlier in the episode. But I think, maybe you agree, that the better comparison, even the best comparison, would be Panama in 1990. Ironically, also January 3rd. Same day.
Well, that is when you started. You get a bit. Is this a conspiracy? Or I'm sure many socialist leaders may get a little bit anxious next year on the third day of the year. But I think we shouldn't take for granted that everyone is extremely familiar with the operation. But it was essentially the removal of the Panamanian president, was Noriega.
Removal of the Panamanian dictator.
Dictator, yeah, exactly.
I don't really mean that in a derogatory way, although it is, because there was a separate person who was also president that was below Noriega. That's why I use that was separate terms.
Yeah, head of state.
Yeah, head of state.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
Better term. Okay, so of course, Panama is a good example for many reasons. Now, 2 points before I give this particular point, which is Panama was under a dictatorship since the 1960s under Omar Torrijos, and it was him that really did a lot of transformation in Panama, which is, again, it's a very Pinochet type scenario where the...
Franco in Spain too.
Or Franco in Spain, okay, true, yes. That the person in charge at the very, very top was not by any means a liberal person or election Democrat. It was completely a military authoritarian system with him at top. The constitution even changed for him to be called like the supreme leader. At the same time, he was the guy that led the negotiations to get the canal to Panama's control. He is under his government that started the international banking sector. It was under his government that started properly the Panama Free Zone for the import-export tax reduction stuff. So all of that really happened under Torrijos, also a particular economist called Nicolas Barletta, who worked under Torrijos, who was also
A Chicago boy.
a Chicago boy, a PhD from Chicago. How funny is that? Anyway,
And a bit unknown.
I
We've
think
gone through
he
the.
is. Did you know him? I think
Not
I
until
asked
we,
people this
yeah,
all the
not
time.
until I met you. And I'm acquainted with the Chicago boys. I'm very close with Jose Piñera, who transformed the Chilean economy. Just an amazing set of reforms. And although he was Harvard trained, but the fact that he was the key Chicago boy, really, which is ironic. And then there was other Chicago boys around the region, which were very relevant economists on their own, and many of them ventured into politics. I kind of cherish a picture that I was sent once by Paulo Guedes, who was the finance minister of Brazil and had a copy of my book about the Madrid economic reforms. But Barletta in Panama is the best kept secret of the entire
Yeah.
Chicago Boys story.
I'm thinking.
Saga.
I'm pretty sure he's still alive. I'm thinking we should do something with him somehow. Cause he also speaks perfect English. He was a world.
We first have to verify.
Yes, he had to.
But
Because he's like 86, so he's up there. But he also was a VP at the World Bank and stuff like that too. So anyway, after this is where we get to the point. So Omar Torrijos is generally seen as a reformer, ironically again. But he died randomly in a helicopter crash.
any conspiracy theories around that?
Many CIA type things, yes. But after he died, the person that then took over the control was Noriega. So Noriega was the head of the state, and then you had different presidents and so on. So Barletta actually became president of Panama under Noriega. There's also a thing people don't know that much, of course. So he became president under Noriega. And at that time, because again, Barletta is a liberal, classical liberal type, Chicago person. But there was a big scandal in Panama at the time where Noriega's goons essentially assassinated a particular journalist and left his head in a different part of the country, and it was a big thing. And Barletta actually spoke up, saying, "Oh, we need to investigate this. This is not good." And he got essentially pushed out by Noriega. He had to go to a mini exile for himself from Panama, and that's when he went to World Bank and so on. He was also president of Panama for 2 years, I believe. His book is here. And Noriega became then this really, really hardcore dictator when it comes to narco trafficking. And for example, when Pablo Escobar and stuff like that was kind of leaving Colombia, they did some stuff in Panama. And I believe there was some documentation where Noriega gave them Panamanian passports or that kind of thing. So he was really involved in this narco world via the Escobars and this kind of network. And
he kind of tainted the Panamanian model.
Terribly.
Which had been one of excellence in the practice of statecraft in many areas.
Yeah, in many areas.
And under Noriega, the whole operation and with Barletta out of the picture, you can understand a bit better why that happened.
Exactly.
And that's why throughout the 90s, even though after he was removed, Panama would become synonymous with, we'll give exile to whoever comes over.
That was all under Noriega.
That was not a thing before.
That was not a thing before. The linchpin. So all of these things happening, again, lots of narco trafficking issues, again, with Escobar, like, you don't need more evidence than that. And the U.S. had these warrants over his arrest and things like that. Similar to Maduro, similar thing. The U.S. had these warrants out for Maduro's capture, for narco trafficking, for conspiracy to sell drugs in the U.S., and all this stuff. One of the big things that happened in 1989, there was an election in Panama where the opposition parties, the dictatorship had a political party that was the PRD. And there were opposition groups that kind of come into a coalition under a guy named Andara. And they actually won the election. This is not disputed because Noriega's like, I don't like that. And he dissolved the election and put his guy, Duque, to president again. That was 1989. And then in the 1990, he was like, okay, this is a clear signal. This can't continue. The Panama Canal now is under stress because, of course, when the treaty for transition was signed by Torrijos in 1977, it was a long transition. The actual handover was 1999. So they saw this as a thing, okay, all of these things happen in Panama. Our biggest asset in the hemisphere is under threat. We have to go in and do something. And that was the Operation Just Cause in January 3rd, 1990. So they went in, they captured Noriega, brought him back to the US. This is where I think people stop thinking about the story. Okay, it's done. Therefore, why continue the story? But the important part is this part. Noriega went through the justice system in the US. So all these questions about was it legal or illegal for the US to go invade, the US just is, I think, very impartial, went through the whole trial. And they said one important thing. So the thing about Maduro and sovereignty you mentioned earlier. How can you capture a head of state? He's not the head of state. And in the Noriega trials, it was USA versus Noriega, in 1993, I think the case was, in Florida, where the court said, but the US government did not recognize Noriega as the head of state. So he cannot be subject to sovereign immunity.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Also, he was subject to many arrest warrants on the US justice. So all these things went through the system, and it will come out to be justifiable cause of what the US did. So isn't even that debatable, to be honest, legally speaking, about the rationality and the judicial action of what the US did to Maduro? Because we have the Panama case as a very strong testament of legality.
Yeah, and again, there's principles behind international law that are obvious to anyone that takes their mind off a current event and just looks at things objectively. And it's obvious that the relations between states are essentially conducted under the assumption that each state is respecting the fundamental covenants that govern the entire system. So name it human rights convention, name it basic considerations of good governance. None of that is met in Venezuela. There's even a doctrine by the United Nations that is sometimes referred to as R2P, responsibility to protect, that explicitly obliges the international community to safeguard the key elements of international law within those countries where it is not being respected. Today, there was this, well, as we're recording this, there was this very interesting comment made by Federico Jiménez Los Santos, a key journalist and writer in Spain. But he was arguing that many European scholars believe that international law was born out of the writings of Francisco de Vitoria, a writer of the School of Salamanca, one of the proto-libertarian thinkers of the 16th century in Spain, just like Juan de Mariana and others did pioneering work in economics. And with Francisco de Vitoria, he developed the concept of international relations between different kings at the time. And he framed it as derecho de gentes, rights of peoples, the plural, instead of human rights, no, but people's rights, the rights of peoples. The concept behind it was that every single individual on earth was deserving of a series of basic, fundamental rights that should be respected by power, whoever was holding that power, and in spite of whichever state was responsible for that, which created a universal recognition of human dignity that still carries on today. It's a central element in our bourgeoisie civilization. And that stems from a way of looking at, well, do we recognize a state where every single thing that they're supposed to do to take care of the life of their citizens, or at least to not destroy the life of their citizens, is not being met? Do we owe any loyalty to a authoritarian, a totalitarian, I would argue, regime that has destroyed every single basic civic, political, economic, and social right? There is no. I don't think we do. And there is international law cases to be made, from the theory to even the practice of a doctrine like that. But of course, a doctrine like that, if it needs to be enforced by the UN, we will have that obvious paradox of having dictators judge whether another guy is a dictator. And
but
of
that's
course,
the case now. That
exactly.
is the UN now. That's why
that is the UN.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that's the UN since the very beginning, when you create a system by which you may have Cuba sitting in the Human Rights Committee, or you may have China,
Saudi Arabia, or China,
taking these sort of decisions.
But one thing, Diego,
Yeah.
is this tension between international law and domestic law. Because what I had mentioned before is not a doctrine or a precedent of international law. That was a precedent of U.S. law.
I was just going there. Exactly. Because this operation was based on the basis of the extrajudicial reach of the U.S. justice system.
But the thing, it's not, this is, I think, a product point. It's not even the extrajudicial.
Yeah, extraterritorial, I mean.
But it's not even that either, because the U.S. didn't just go to Venezuela and decide justice. Mm-hmm. They brought Maduro to the U.S.
Well, I meant extraterritorial, the act that you can pursue legal crimes committed in the U.S., and we're about to get into that discussion, by actually physically capturing someone outside of your jurisdiction.
Yeah.
That could be the discussion, right? But the case that has been brought up and has been put to trial in the US and several individuals have been found guilty is essentially ties everything back to the origin of this conversation when we were discussing about how this dictatorship was a rogue regime that was actively engaging not only in democratic hindrance practices across the globe, but also in active relations with terrorist groups such as the FARC in Colombia. Now, Venezuela went from being quite a clean country in terms of illegal activity of drug trafficking into becoming the hub for drug trafficking in Latin America, alongside every other country that has been infected by the Bolivarian socialism. Case in point, Ecuador. Ecuador is still dealing with the massive infiltration of the FARC,
Yes.
which funded the campaign of Rafael Correa to begin with, which, by the way, led the US military base out of the country, which created additional problems for Ecuadorian citizens as a result of that vacuum of de facto enforcement. So there's no US military base which act as deterrents. And there is a government, a socialist government, that is in cahoots with the terrorists and the narcos in Colombia. So of course they will infiltrate our economy, our territory. And that is why Ecuador last year was the 6th most dangerous country in the world, in spite of the crackdown against violence, which has led to some advances and results. Not as many as or as deep as in El Salvador. And also, that is why it's the money laundering capital of Latin America.
That's right.
And all of that is Cuba to Venezuela to Colombia to Ecuador. It is a link of a chain of events that has connected all the wrongdoings and everything that is bad about the left and about socialism connected with outright crime.
I feel like the reason why people really get hooked up on this aspect of the conversation is they really do not understand the illegitimacy of Maduro. Because it's, even in US media, it's the president of Venezuela to this day. So, yeah, it's not all media now, but they don't get it. If I would ask someone in America, maybe not anyone, but some people, do you think it was illegitimate for the US to go and hunt down Bin Laden? Most people said, of course not. We can go get him. He damaged the country, of course. He's not head of state and so on. But yet, when you say Maduro, they're like...
Wait, his body was thrown in the middle of the ocean. Which, not much was done out of that.
Yes.
And maybe that is something you can have a conversation, because that guy should have been put to trial, right?
You can say that. Sure.
I'm not going to feel sorry for...
No. But the problem of hunting him down was never the issue.
Exactly.
But why is it now an issue with Maduro? Because it's the same structural thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the direct link to...
But who will raise these concerns? Nassim Taleb coined this. I just used it before. A certain type of individual will raise this concern. And we call them intellectual, yet idiot. You can overthink and over-argue and over-communicate any sort of legal basis or grounds. But the whole discussion is rigged. Because we're not talking of a legitimate president.
But no. My thing is this. Even if we are not talking about legit president, there is legal grounds that support the idea that that is why we should get him. Mm-hmm. This is the thing, right?
Yeah.
If people say, but it's against international... Again, they don't actually know...
So Hitler was a head of state and Bin Laden was not a head of state. Should have he not intervened against one or the other?
Silly things.
Yeah.
But the court case of Noriega in 1990... in Florida District Court, USA versus Noriega, already answered this question. Was it legal for the US to capture Noriega in Panama? Because this was one of the points the Noriega defense team used. The US does not have jurisdiction to capture me in my country. And the court was like, no. You have arrest warrants in our country. We therefore have jurisdiction.
You.
Exactly.
Yeah. You could always ask Maduro to extradite himself. I guess the intellectual yet idiot type would want that, right? I was crunching some numbers for today's podcast too. And since the early 20th century all the way up to today, there's been 160 coup d'etat type of situations in Latin America. Overthrows of a government from the early 20th century.
Okay.
So essentially 1900 all the way up until today. 160. Roughly, I'm running out the numbers. And U.S. interference has been present in 40 of them. So that essentially shows you that, of course, there's a big 800-pound gorilla in the room. You're not going to just stay away off of those, or the US could, but it's choosing not to stay away of the business of one out of every four of these processes. But what happens to three out of the other four? Those were completely internal dynamics or regional dynamics where the US was not involved. Many examples come to mind. I recall the case of the Honduras president, Eduardo Zelaya, who was trying to run for re-election with the support from Hugo Chavez. Was, by the way, entering a similar oil deal as the one that Barbados turned down, but many other countries did agree to do. So Zelaya was his name. He was not allowed to remain in office because there was a limit on terms, but he chose to. Then the assembly voted him out and he decided to stay. Then the Constitutional Court told him to remove himself from office because he was no longer allowed to be in office. And he decided to stay. So what happens when the Constitutional Court says no? The Constitution itself says no. It wasn't really that much room for interpretation. It was a term limit, period. And the Assembly says no. This, by the way, happened in 2007, more or less. And he still decided to stay. Well, the military, the local military in Honduras, decided to essentially grab him at night, put him on a helicopter, and left him in his pajamas right off the border in one of the neighboring countries. I don't recall which one. So they just took him all the way out of the country and took him 1 meter away from the country and just left him there, astray. So quite a colorful way to go around it. There's other cases.
Even in remind me, was it not also in 1990, the same year we had the Noriega intervention? Wasn't that the same year Fujimori in Peru as well?
Yeah. When Fujimori comes to power, he wins an election 2 years before, I think, Noriega. I think it's 88, but essentially late 80s, early 90s, he comes to power and he's democratically elected. It's only that Fujimori then holds power for the entire 1990s, although being elected in elections, then has been accused of different series of human rights violations, especially his vice president, Vladimir Montesinos, and different power overreach. So at the end of the day, when he's run out of power, he is considered to be a dictator at this point, although he was democratically elected. He actually beat Vargas Llosa, who was a Nobel Prize winner in literature in his case, and a very significant member of the libertarian network in the Hispanic world, and who used to network with many of these political leaders from Latin America that lean more into our ideas here in Madrid, although he was Peruvian born. And there was also the case of Fernando Lugo. Is the only Bolivarian leader that essentially did not contest being removed from power. All of them fought tooth and nail, like Correa in Ecuador clinched to power. Even Morales right now is fleeing justice in Bolivia. Of course, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner did everything in her power and more to avoid eventually being convicted for her crimes. Same with Dilma and Lula. Lula was in jail too in Brazil. So reality does catch up with them, but...
Sorry, by the way, I do want to mention Dilma. She is now the president of the International Development Bank, Chinese-funded loan mill, by the way. And she's now in China. So,
makes a lot of sense. So she did a great job overseeing projects in Latin America. She did such a great job that the most corrupt company in history, really, in Latin America, which is Odebrecht, yeah. It was a Brazilian state champion, private in theory, public in practice, state champion of Brazil that ran into dozens of corruption scandals in every single country in which it went in.
You hear the stories of this company, like, how is this real?
Yeah. Because they're all different and they're all the same. Like you go to Colombia, you go to Peru, you go to Chile, you go to Panama. There's a story and another story and another story about Brazilian state champion Odebrecht just meddling into not just corruption, but also political funding and whatnot. But the only case I can think of a government that was propped by the Bolivarians in Venezuela and that more or less agreed that it was time to leave and actually left, which was kind of a surprise because everyone was second guessing, right? That's it? You're respecting the rules? Because that was a one-off, I'm guessing, was Fernando Lugo, who was a priest, was a president of Paraguay. He did have 7 secret children, quite the unorthodox priest that later came out to surface. But he was voted out by Congress and he actually respected the decision to be voted out. But all of the other ones, they clinched to power with the support of the Venezuelans. So like, good luck trying to extradite a guy that is actually stopping democratic change, not just in Venezuela, in other countries.
Correct.
And the specific case for which he's going to be put into trial is connected to the Tren del Sol, or Cartel del Sol, Cartel of the Sun, or the Train of the Sun, which is the name given to the Venezuelan, but not strictly Venezuelan, also Colombian and other countries involved, narco operation that was channeling illicit drug trade into the US to the degree that they were given institutional protection from the get-go from the Venezuelan authorities. That means that Maduro has been charged with these crimes. And now he will have to answer in front of a US judge. But the operation in itself has been put to trial, convicted, and some of its members were actually brought to the macro prison Salvador. There was a lot of discussion of how can the US be exporting its prisoners to another country. When that discussion arose, those prisoners were tied to this and were in jail because of this same scandal. The institutional protection given to these narcos was given by the Maduro regime.
I saw a social media discussion. I don't know if it's true. It was the son of El Chapo going to testify.
Well, most likely.
Against Maduro.
And the rhetoric by the U.S. authorities against Mexico has now taken a turn for more action against the narcos. So, which kind of points to that nexus as well, which is interesting because for a while, their Fox and their Calderon and their Peña Nieto, those relationships were more or less functional. Under López Obrador, they're clearly not. And this happened under a Democratic administration, by the way, under Joe Biden. And now with Claudia Sheinbaum, of course, Marco Rubio, who wears a dozen hats these days, he has to broker that relationship. But the President Trump, he's made it fairly clear that he wants Mexico to crack down on this flow of drugs. Now, that opens many conversations, like should drugs be illegal? Like many libertarians would argue otherwise, and therefore they could contest that, well, the whole war on drugs effort is misguided. That is a conversation to be had. Like folks at Cato have certainly made that claim for the years, and there are some merits to that sort of framework. But as long as there is violence and illicit trade according to the rules of the game that we have, are the current existing laws and regulations of the country, of the land, then it seems to be very likely that Maduro will get sentenced and will actually get a very serious sentence. My question is transition, because that's the other topic that we should jump into. What does that look like for Venezuela? Because this wasn't a Middle East type of intervention, as in I get rid of Saddam and then I run the country. It's not. Trump is hoping he can force change on the regime, and he's acknowledging that if he was just to transfer power, the structures of governance are rotten. So it wouldn't just be as easy as, okay, let's put in Edmundo or Corina Machado and that'll be it.
But even then, I think this part is the least thought through. Okay, to be clear.
It's less clear, for sure.
I would say the public statements of the administration are the least thoughtful ones they've given on this topic with regards to transition. Because when you have Delcy now as the interim president, I mean, what do you expect to happen?
Delcy, by the way, Delcy Rodriguez took over power for Maduro. It was a choice probably of either is it Delcy or Diosdado Cabello, who is the leader of the crackdown against the opposition, the more violent member of the cabinet, if you wish. So in a way, if we have to choose between Delcy and Diosdado, he would, in principle, look more like a Gorbachev, potentially, hopefully, than he could ever, right? So if...
I don't even expect that. That's a Gorbachev, that's a wild analogy, I think. Wild. But, of course, technically, she was the VP.
Well, Gorbachev is extremely overrated, because the only thing he did right is acknowledging he was wrong. But I digress.
Yes. But no, perestroika was that's a different conversation. And
we're in an hour and a half. I don't think we need a perestroika deep dive now.
But to use the Panama analogy, after Noriega was deposed and the U.S. took him away, the U.S., essentially military government, they installed the guy, Endara, who had won the last election, and he ran the interim government in the meantime.
You restore legitimacy.
Yeah. And then for the next election, that was like 1994 in Panama. So like 4 years later, that was a while before it had, as Panama's a small country, they had 4 years later to have an election. This was actually a funny thing. I'll make this point quickly. When they had the election in 1994, it was the actual Torrijos Noriega party that won the election.
Yeah.
It's a whole twist of fate, but it was a very different orientation.
Yes,
very pro-business.
That part is still alive.
Yeah, that part, very much alive.
It's a power machine.
Yeah, power machine. Yeah, very much alive.
PRD.
But that was a super pro-business party at the time, and it's a whole different thing. So the point is, when now they have this intervention, that you cannot take any transition seriously until you have a completely different top layer of government. You can just say, hey, acknowledge the previous election or do a new one from scratch. Let Montego actually be on the ballot and so on, so on, so on. But until you do that, I don't know what kind of transition you can even discuss.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, of course, with the celebrations and the happiness and joy that came with the removal of Maduro. And by the way, the very symbolic bombing of the Chavez mausoleum, which, I mean, what can I say? Like, if you're going all in, just,
Yeah.
I mean, symbols matter,
Yeah,
you
symbols
know?
matter.
And I sure could do away with a few statues that I see every now and then around the street here in my country that shouldn't be there. I mean, there's a Che Guevara statue in a coastal area in the region where I'm originally from. In
I actually, what's it, Oviedo?
Oleiros, a
I saw
beautiful
this.
coastal
Yes.
city in La Coruña. It's a roundabout in the.
It's red, right? A big red thing. I remember that.
It's kind of iron
Right,
made, like
okay.
so it has this
Like rusty.
rusty type of oxidous type of material, and it's the shape of his beard and his head and his features. And then there's nothing else in between. So it's actually in the air. So what you'd see is the silhouette, the typical you would see in a Che Guevara t-shirt, right? It's the same picture.
That same town in your region, they have a communist party.
Yeah, but it's not a real communist. It's actually pretty well run, if I must, which makes sense to those people that argue they're libertarians at the macro level and communists at the local level. I'm not one of those, but like my family, my cousins and uncles live there, and I grill them about this every now and then, and they're happy. So
the only reason I even know this,
it's a posh area. It's a posh area, by the way.
Yes. I think you might be surprised why I even noticed that this, but I saw a YouTube video recently about this town. That's why
yeah. So that's very random that you know so much about the coastal town of La Coruña called Oleiros. But yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Yeah.
But yeah, like mausoleum bombing and whatnot. But the transition really, beyond the happiness and the joy that was celebrated by so many Venezuelans, which I completely understand and agree with. The next step is figuring out how does a transition look like? What does it look like? And President Trump made this very, I would say, quite peculiar statement about Maria Corina Machado. When he said, essentially, she's a very nice lady. She doesn't have the respect of the entire population. My first reaction to this comment was very negative. How can you say that? When someone delegate has or surrogate has won an election so large, and someone has been awarded the Nobel Prize for her peace efforts and really is championed as such, not as some previous awardees like Obama and even
or
worse.
others, like that lady, that girl from Afghanistan.
Malala. Or,
Malala.
What's her claim? Like, are we getting Greta Thunberg next or what? Rigoberta Menchú.
I must say though, this year's Nobel Peace Prize for Machado was such a good prize. Like, I can't think of any recent Nobel Peace Prize even remotely the caliber of this.
That's why it had such a remarkable impact. It was such an iconic event.
10 heads of state going.
Exactly. The world was watching as she was getting this award. So obviously my blood was boiling first when I heard that statement, and I was looking into Marco Rubio's eyes to see whether I could gauge some sort of reaction, which he did a good work of just keeping composure because we all know how the boss is. But in later statements and with further clarification, and of course the tone I don't agree with, but if we judge Trump by the way he says things and what he says, not what he does, then if we judge just because of what he says, like then we just throw the entire presidency out of the window, right? But then you have to make it a bit complex. And I do think these things should matter more, and he could do a much better job of not having such a loud mouth all the time, which I think is a big problem. And I think he should get called out even more than he does for that. However,
but he can't, because the people that work for him can't do it because they will get fired.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's total power.
A viable option.
He's a monarch right now. But my point here, I was circling to Rubio, and the way they've clarified that statement since then, they essentially believe that if the military still has so much control of political, economic life in Venezuela, if the justice system is so corrupt, and if 8 million people have left, probably carry the legitimacy for change, and are not living in the country right now, some sort of transition period is due. And transition does not look like a naive take on this would suggest of, well, we'll just hold an election and this time that will be it. I would be hoping an election would be set, but I don't think you can have an election tomorrow and you can have all the conditions for the result to be respected and the future of Venezuela to be left into the hands that the Venezuelan people choose, which, of course, I'm hoping that would be Maria Corina Machado. But that transition needs to happen, and they're expecting that pressure from Washington will be enough to force that transition to be a working transition. The fact that several prisoners have been released so far is a promising start, but it will take a lot of pressure. I don't know if the energy and the focus is there on this administration. Any action like this would be surely welcome on my end in Nicaragua, in Cuba,
Cuba.
etc. But if they can keep the focus and they can keep de-escalating things, then maybe with the support of all the oil resources that are going to be very clearly controlled by the US government and the companies they decide to
I
bring
think
on
the
board.
oil is overblown. Even recently, you have ExxonMobil and so on saying, hey, we can't do much with the oil in Venezuela. This is one thing Trump really overplayed
Yeah.
because the price of oil is now so low, 50 a barrel, US dollars, that it's not economical to extract the oil in Venezuela because it's not Saudi oil where like scratch the surface and you put it in a
It pops
car.
out, yeah.
It's deep oil, it's dirty oil.
It's more than 30 a barrel, so the profit margins are not that high.
It's not worth it.
But even worse, we jump into that conversation because at the end of the day, if you're talking transition, you need resources to fund a transition, which means oil. And the Venezuelan oil company, PDVSA, which is a state giant, it used to be a state corporation that gave permits to private companies that then would run the oil industry in exchange for some profit sharing and or tax arrangements, just like in Ecuador before it was expropriated by the regime. And what PDVSA has now is a gigantic debt, a huge arbitration debt as well. So it's not just company debt in its operations, it's also arbitration debt to creditors, to former owners of the companies that were expropriated. And then there is the lack of investment in the infrastructure that is a big problem and a big opportunity. A problem because it means that you have roughly $40 billion in unpaid bills, plus you have a dated and old infrastructure. So that's bad news. The promising news there is that if you invest, if you're able to start from scratch somehow, you can lower the price of production and that can make the deal a lot more attractive.
Of course,
a Spanish company, Repsol, is very knowledgeable of the Venezuelan market.
As you know, and
had very constructive meetings with Trump recently. And I would argue that Repsol stands to be a more relevant player than most US producers because they know what it takes to turn this thing around.
Long time ago, right? But rule of law. There is no investment in Venezuela without the rule of law and the court system. There is no court rule of law without the government.
Well, my consultancy firm represents a client of a creditor of the Kingdom of Venezuela. Now, he is owed money for some of the expropriations that happened back in the day, and they are hoping they can get paid through the Texas subsidiary of PDVSA, which still has not been turned over to the creditors, but hopefully it should be so because with the current context, I don't see how the authorities could resist it any longer. It's called Citgo. It's essentially the U.S. operation of PDVSA. And this creditor is waiting to get paid, and he will get paid, but he will get paid through running this on international arbitration, beating the kingdom, the state of Venezuela in international arbitration, trying to claim this debt, getting rejected by the Venezuelan state, going to a U.S. judge, getting the award registered, and then getting paid. Hopefully, through essentially another embargo, seizure of their assets.
I think this part is going to be the long road ahead because the oil isn't enough. The money from the oil isn't enough. The only way I can see this having enough financial power is if the U.S. give a loan. Similar to the Marshall Plan, similar to all the other things within the swap agreement in Argentina would be late.
Which has been closed, by the way, since we last recorded.
I think they will probably get a new one.
A small little profit for the U.S. involved too.
Yeah.
Symbolic.
It's fine. I'm a big fan of these kind of symbols. I think they might have a new swap eventually. But the U.S. might have
dollars.
Let's not go ahead of this now. The U.S. might need to give some loans to Venezuela. Very hard condition loans, to be clear, but I don't think they're going to avoid that. You have to give the loans.
And then the intellectual yet idiot will be speaking about how the U.S. is, conditioning support to Venezuela after keeping his mouth shut for the last 25 years of these loans given by China and others too.
And there's actually good legal argument, potentially, for it's also why the transition has to really happen sooner. There is good legal argument that the loans from China are not state loans because they were never approved by Congress in Venezuela, and technically they're on the balance sheet of Bandis, which is the development corporation in
You could
charge,
declare bankrupt.
you could declare bankruptcy because it was never approved as a sovereign loan. That's why I think China is very worried now about this thing because of how these networks are done. So the Band-Aids was not a congressional oversight system. So the loans shouldn't really have sovereign immunity when it comes to the bankruptcy court. So we can see this can go all kind of ways to even reduce the debt. Also, it's a good transition and these kind of things. But you need to have an election, to have a new Congress, and all of these different topics. I do not know.
Well,
if
the
it's
companies are essentially bankrupt. So
everything's
it
bankrupt.
wouldn't be a case of the U.S. screwing China out of this debt. No, that debt is non-payable.
It's
But
not
of
payable.
course, whenever
Well,
you're dealing with
could-
that, you want to
But
restructure.
it could be seen as screwing China, but it's not the U.S.'s fault. It is these contracts the Chinese government allowed to be signed
Exactly.
because it was not congressionally approved.
Yeah.
You can see where the balance sheet is, right? So China is definitely worried. But I think many ways China has already written off this debt. I do not think they believe. I'll be surprised if they believe they will get this money back.
Yeah.
The reason why I think this is because after a lot of this debacle happened with the loans and Maduro crashed, Chinese state restructured how they actually did loans. So I think they mentally figured, okay, we f***ed up. We can't do this again. So we have to actually restructure how
We were
our
doing
own
well on the explicit
portfolio.
language, but now you just earned the little E sign.
Well, we're not on YouTube, so it's
Okay,
fine.
that's fine.
So because of that, I don't think they actually believe they're going to get the money back at all. Maybe it won't be that big of a diplomatic pressure type scenario if they just cancel the debt from China under the Tevez Maduro regime. But that's one concept to kind of reduce that debt. But the US might really have to put up some money.
I think we've done the thorough discussion of several topics today. We first sat down to speak about this with the idea of sort of explaining the many sources of illegitimacy of this government that seems to be starting to crumble after it was decapitated in a way with the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And we've run through how regularly in the last several decades, what Venezuelans have gone through is a complete destruction of democracy, of economic conditions, and even human dignity and the ability to protest, dissent, and even live with some of the most basic needs. I think that statistic that I gave of how the average Venezuelan has lost roughly 20 pounds because of pure hunger, mere hunger,
It's shocking.
is such a shocking number. And the fact that their income is akin to what it was in 1945.
I remember also a news investigative article in the New York Times years ago talking about one of the fastest growing industries in Venezuela under Maduro, and it was baby coughings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, infant mortality was...
It was just shockingly high.
But it's what you get. There was other diseases that had disappeared from the country and that were recurrently becoming an issue again, similar to what has happened in Cuba. So it's a humanitarian catastrophe if there was one. By the way, for the intellectual yet idiot who would invoke arguments against international action, certainly Venezuela calls for a humanitarian action because of the issue of hunger and just starvation that the population is going through. And then, of course, disease. We've gone through how China and Iran and other regimes have partnered with Venezuela to create this network of just bad actors at the international level. And we've also spoken about how the meddling into other affairs in the Hispanic world, even with narco trafficking in the US, which actually leads to this operation, is the best case that you can probably make against anyone that is positioning this as thou shall not get into the issues of the Venezuelans. Well, the Venezuelans have been getting into the issues of every single country in Latin America, into Spain, meddling with China, with Iran, and partnering with those regimes to continue doing a lot more bad than good for sure. And then we went over this particular operation to remove Maduro, what the perspectives for change are. And I think we could close this discussion with some final thoughts, but we will revisit this. And we have some guests lined up. So I would love it if you could introduce some of that, because a friend of yours has a very interesting profile. She has worked on this matter a lot and she's already agreed to be on our podcast. So the best way to lock that in is to just announce it right now. And I can also share that we've been in touch with a series of individuals who have been put into prison and tortured, as we mentioned before, by the Venezuelan regime. And they will be guests in our podcast very soon. So expect a lot more content on this topic.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be going into this a lot more. Hopefully, there's also going to be some more optimistic news in the next few weeks when we come back here also on this topic. But yeah, this is going to be a key issue for sure.
This was an optimistic podcast, I would say.
I mean, we were optimistic.
We're not doom and gloom type of.
But I'm hoping the situation becomes even more optimistic.
It'll take some time.
Yeah, to be clear, this was a good thing. There is no qualification to use. It was a good thing that happened.
Fantastic. I think we should rejoice on the fact that some justice will be brought to someone who has been responsible for so much bad in the world and in his own country. I think Hugo Chavez, of course, be damned. So happy even his remains have been bombed away, quite honestly. Even that symbol is something I feel like I don't think I could see a world in which his remains should be celebrated instead of actually repudiated. You could argue it's his bones, but one could say there's a lot of symbolism in creating this state mausoleum into the man that has essentially ruined your country and killed many people and driven millions into exile. And then the prospects for change remain there. Dollarization was a very popular idea in Venezuela in the 90s.
It should happen again.
So
bring it back.
Bring that conversation back. Maybe they'll do it before Milei. He's certainly dragging his feet on that.
He's dragging his feet. Diego, until then, and we will have our next conversation.